I invite you all to be seated, and we are inviting for Sam Altis, who is the director of the Association of Faith Community Shelter. Get everything out of the way.
Thank you. Got a lot to do. Good morning.
Morning.
Good to be with you all. I've started to kind of think about my time with you all twice a year as a kind of holiday where I come and get to thank you primarily, but also to celebrate our work together. So that's what I hope we can kind of do this morning. First off, let me offer that thank you for another month of hosting the shelter. It goes far and beyond what you think in terms of impact. You might have noticed if you cooked a meal this month or stopped by the shelter, a smaller crowd than usual. We had some nights just like 3 folks actually at dinner. We had more than that in the shelter, but just 3 around for dinner, which is probably the smallest crowd I've ever seen. But it's for good reason. This month, I'm happy to say we have 5 shelter members move into permanent housing. And literally the weekend before this month started, we had 2 others. So in the last 30 days, but 7 people move into permanent housing from the shelter. So we had a smaller crowd, but for good reason, and we'll welcome new folks in as soon as we can. So I'm really grateful for your time, the space that you provide. That gave a lot of those folks who found housing just a little extra breathing room where they could, instead of focusing on, all right, where am I going to go today during a rainy day, they got to stay in here and they got to kind of catch their breath and have a little more emotional and mental capacity to focus on housing and moving forward. We also had quite a few folks who caught the flu this past month, and you provided quarantine space for them. So it allowed them to rest, to heal, so they weren't outside getting other people sick. They weren't in our group getting everyone sick. So it was a really, really beneficial month, and you used your space really well. So thank you so much. I do gotta say, we missed having Jane around as much. It was our first time hosting without Jane, and we missed you quite a bit, Jane, but we're really happy that you get to take a bit more time. So people asked about you quite a bit. They said, where's Jane? Where's Jane? Where's Jane? She's still around. So I'm grateful to all of you for your generosity, your space, your time, and the warm presence that you offered our shelter members. So let's look at the text. I think it has something to do with offering hospitality and holiness and space for people. A lot of the times stories in the Bible strike me as a little bit funny, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but more in a way where I see them as sort of quirky and hopefully insightful. This one gets me because it starts out with the writer basically admitting that every person who witnessed this event was half asleep. Which is a really weird way to start, because it's a wild story. Like, it involves like these strange figures and God speaking in clouds, and it almost immediately is like, do they really see that? Like, they were pretty sleepy. I don't think the point is to think about, all right, do they actually see this? What actually happened? I think what is actually going on is it's asking us not to get caught up in the event itself, but what the story can teach us and where it can lead us. One of the big things that I think it can teach us is how and where we see the holy. Those things in our world that are sacred and special. The story asks us to examine where we encounter God. It's a story about one of those sacred moments. The disciples, sleepy as they are, witness a really wild and sacred event. Jesus is talking to 2 of the biggest figures in Jewish history, in Moses and Elijah, and then they actually hear the voice of God. I'm not sure it gets more sacred than that. As often happens, Peter responds by sticking his foot in his mouth and offering to build altars on the spot. What's even funnier to me is God literally interrupts him, which has to be incredibly embarrassing if God gives you I'm going to stop you there, buddy. Peter took one for the team, as he tends to do, so I think we could learn something. Encountering the sacred isn't about remembering particular places or events, as helpful as those can be. In fact, this story doesn't even tell us where this event took place, just in case we get a little preoccupied like Peter did and want to go back and make it extra special and sacred. The holy isn't supposed to be something that we occasionally revisit at particular spots. I think what the story is trying to teach us is that the holy is something we strive to see daily in the world around us. And this actually is kind of what happens as the stories continue in the text. If you read on, the stories afterward show a contrast between how Jesus views the world and how his disciples do. Right after this, instead of kind of like sitting in this really transcendent, holy moment, Jesus comes down off the mountain and he immediately heals a boy who the disciples were not able to heal. Right after that, the disciples get in an argument about which one of them is the greatest, which is a pretty conceited argument. And Jesus responds by saying greatness doesn't come from power or influence, but by having the openness and the humility of a child. Then after that, the disciples decide they want to call down fire on a Samaritan village. And if you remember maybe from other stories, Samaritans and Jewish individuals were not great friends. So they say, this village rejected Jesus, let's burn it to the ground. Jesus quickly dismisses that idea and tells them to keep moving forward. While his disciples are caught up in ego trips, in influence, in rivalries, Jesus seems to be seeing the world around him as sacred. From the boy that he heals, to the children in his audience, and even to a village of seeming rivals that rejected him. Now, all of this is not meant to devalue spiritual retreat or spiritual practice. We certainly need moments where we set aside to pray, reflect, meditate, do whatever it does that draws you more into the sacred. That's what Jesus is doing on that mountaintop. But those moments, I think, should allow us to open our eyes more fully to see the entire world as a divine miracle. And then in response to that, act accordingly. To offer what healing we can, to embrace those who may seem powerless, and to love those that we're taught to hate. These moments of reflection, like a Sunday morning perhaps, give us the fuel we need to see the world as sacred, and then to make it a place where everyone is treated as such. You know, there are cheaper fuels out there for this sort of work, and I feel them and use them sometimes. Fuels like anger and ego and influence. And they may be helpful in getting us moving on that work of building a better world. But for me personally, those fuels tend to burn out pretty quickly. I end up really tired, overwhelmed, and burn out. But when I can see the world around me as sacred, and all the people in it as a sacred gift from God, it turns out I get a little more patience, and I get a little more kind as I go about that work. I can handle the ups and downs, the seeming defeats, knowing that they're not the end of the story. And I have more capacity to humanize the people around me, and hopefully to be a little less self-righteous along the way. You know, it's a tough time to see the world as sacred. I'm not going to pretend like it's not. It seems a bit in vogue right now to dehumanize others, especially politically in the United States. Our immigrant neighbors are feeling the weight of this in this particular moment. Our unhoused neighbors constantly feel the weight of this in their day-to-day. But what I've seen in working with those groups and those people is that a bad season doesn't mean that the sacred has somehow disappeared. It's in those seasons that it's most important for us to continue to see our world as holy and to press forward together. There's one particular story that I've been thinking about kind of in this season and sharing with folks that reminds me of this, and it's Michelle's story. Michelle grew up locally in the San Lorenzo Valley and then over the hill in San Jose. And like many folks that we work with in AFC, a series of bad breaks led her to our programs. They derailed her life. It started in her early 20s when she was hit by a drunk driver and left permanently disabled. Well, this was devastating. She is a very resilient person. She made the best of it. She got married. She began working as an artist and selling her goods at local craft fairs and shows. Despite that perseverance, she caught another bad break when she went through a divorce and was then unable to pay her rent on her own. She decided to move into her vehicle, and that brought her to AFC's safe parking program. Life was tough, but she was managing. She settled in, this was during the pandemic, and she began to find community with her fellow safe parkers. What she didn't know, though, was that the hardest thing was yet to come for her. After experiencing a series of really strange medical symptoms and countless trips to the doctors, she was diagnosed with an incurable autoimmune disorder that was going to slowly take away her mobility. In the immediate, the diagnosis meant that she had her driver's license revoked for medical reasons. And as much as we wanted her to stay on our safe parking program, it meant she couldn't because she couldn't operate her vehicle legally anymore. At that time, she was not interested in our shelter. So what she decided to do was she got a school bus and she had a friend drive it to downtown Santa Cruz, where she parked in front of City Hall. And friends would come every day and just move it from parking spot to parking spot so she wasn't ticketed. And that worked for a bit. Like, she made a decent living of it. It was still tough. But then the city of Santa Cruz passed its oversized vehicle ordinance, which meant that vehicles of that size were no longer allowed on the street. And in the first 10 days, she got 10 tickets, which very quickly made her realize this was no longer sustainable. With no other options, she finally decided to join our shelter. And like many, she had a really negative view of shelters. She envisioned them as dangerous and chaotic and dirty. If you stopped by some evening this past month, I don't think you found anything dangerous, chaotic, and usually not too dirty, I don't believe. And what she found was very different as well. She was shocked by the community that she found. Her fellow shelter members really enveloped her. They helped her. On the hardest days of her illness, they went above and beyond to look out for her like a family member. She found that volunteers who were bringing food were warm and hospitable and treated her like a human being. And she found that staff were really diligent in caring and reconnecting her to housing services. Those services led her to get a housing voucher, which I've shared a bit about with you before. But housing vouchers basically subsidize your rent, so you pay 30 to 40% of your income, and the Housing and Urban Development Department pays the rest. It's how most folks on a fixed income can actually afford housing. So after a long and tiring housing search, she found a little cabin up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. She was shocked by how perfect it was for her. It was single story, so as her mobility declined, she would be able to navigate it with a wheelchair. It was quiet and peaceful. It had a yard for her dog. She joked it was a little too perfect because it even had a little babbling brook in the backyard. It got a little kind of too on the nose in terms of quaintness, but she was good with it. I had the privilege of visiting her a while back, and it was one of those moments where it was not hard to see the sacred. Life had been really unjustly hard on her. But with resilience, community, and support, she found a way to thrive, to keep going. And she said some words that really, really stuck with me. She said, "It's like paradise. As much as I hurt from this disease, I'm at peace. Everywhere I look is beauty. It's been months now and I still have a hard time closing my eyes. It's like I'm dreaming." Life is not promised to be easy or just, but God is inviting us to see it all as sacred and to respond with faithful work. Work that insists that we belong to one another, and work that creates a world where everyone is allowed to thrive. So even when it's hard, let's keep going. Amen.